A 5-year-old girl is playing on her bike outside her own house. Friends around her, streetlights just starting to come on. And then, in the space of a few seconds, she's gone. Seen getting into a stranger's car on an ordinary residential street in a small market town where everybody knows everybody. What followed was the largest police search in British history, a nationwide manhunt, and a trial that exposed one of the darkest, most calculated minds Wales has ever seen. This is the story of April Jones. April Sue Lynn Jones was born on the 4th of April 2007 and lived with her family on the Bryn y Gog estate in Machynlleth, a small market town in Powys, mid-Wales. She had mild cerebral palsy. She was, by every account of those who knew her, a happy, sociable little girl who loved being outside with her friends. On the evening of the 1st of October 2012, April had just come home from swimming lessons. She went out to play with friends near her house, riding her bike on the street she'd grown up on, the kind of ordinary evening that happens on residential streets across the country every single day of the year. And then a car pulled up. Witnesses would later tell police they saw April get into that vehicle. Within moments, she was gone. Not wandered off, not lost. Taken, in full view of the street she lived on, by someone in a car. Her parents, Paul and Coral Jones, realized almost immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. April didn't come home. And in a town the size of Machynlleth, where a missing 5-year-old is not something that happens quietly, the alarm went up fast. What followed was, by any measure, extraordinary. Dyfed Powys Police launched what would become the largest search operation in British policing history. Hundreds of officers, search dogs, helicopters, volunteers from the local community and beyond, walking fields, searching rivers, checking every outbuilding and hedgerow for miles around. The story dominated national and international news within hours. A small Welsh town that most people outside Wales had never heard of suddenly had the entire country watching, waiting, hoping. They were looking for a 5-year-old girl who might still be alive. What they eventually found instead pointed towards something far darker. Detective Superintendent Andrew John, the man who led the investigation for Dyfed Powys Police, later described the moment he received the initial call reporting April's disappearance. A moment that set in motion one of the most intensive manhunts Wales had ever seen. Let's slow down and look at what actually happened during those first hours, because the scale of the response tells its own story. Within minutes of April's disappearance being reported, officers were on the Bryn y Gog estate going door to door. Within hours, that had escalated into something far bigger. Dyfed Powys Police, a force covering a large, mostly rural part of Wales, found itself coordinating what would eventually be recognized as the largest search operation in British policing history. Think about what that actually requires. Hundreds of police officers, drawn in from forces well beyond mid-Wales, specialist search teams, dog units trained to track scent across open countryside, helicopters sweeping the hills and valleys around Machynlleth, divers searching the River Dyfi, the same river that runs directly through the town. And alongside all of that, hundreds of ordinary members of the public, neighbors, parents, complete strangers who drove in from other parts of Wales and England simply to help, walking fields in organized lines, checking hedgerows, outbuildings, disused barns, anywhere a small child might conceivably be found. This wasn't a search that lasted a single afternoon. It stretched on for days, then weeks, consuming the resources of an entire regional police force and drawing volunteers from across the country, all searching for one 5-year-old girl who might still, against increasingly unlikely odds as the days passed, be found alive. The national and international media attention that descended on Machynlleth during this period was intense, almost beyond precedent for a town of its size. A small Welsh market town, population barely 2,000, suddenly had television crews from across Britain and beyond camped on its streets, broadcasting live updates on a search that the entire country was following in real time. And then, within days, the search's focus shifted. Investigators had a name. Mark Bridger lived a short drive from McKinley in the village of Sinews in a rented cottage called Mount Pleasant. On paper, there was nothing that marked him out. A 46-year-old former slaughterhouse worker, a former lifeguard, someone who had lived quietly in the area for years. The kind of person neighbors might describe as unremarkable if they were asked to describe him at all. Officers searched Mount Pleasant. According to those present, the cottage was hot inside and smelled strongly of cleaning products, details that would later take on significant weight once forensic examiners began their work. The forensic examination of Mount Pleasant told a story that stood in direct contradiction to Bridger's own account. Officers recovered drops of April's blood inside the cottage itself, not on a roadside, not near a vehicle, but inside Bridger's own home. Alongside the blood, forensic teams recovered fragments of bone, later assessed as likely belonging to an adolescent human skeleton. This physical evidence, gathered methodically over the following days by forensic officers working the scene, directly contradicted Bridger's own account of a roadside accident he claimed he could not remember the aftermath of. The cottage itself was considered evidence significant enough that during the first week of the trial, the jury was taken to visit it in person. Walking through the same rooms where investigators had found April's blood and the bone fragments that would go on to form a central pillar of the prosecution's case. For the investigating team, led by Detective Superintendent Andrew John, the case that emerged from this physical evidence required piecing together an account Bridger himself was determined never to fully provide. He never told police, and never told the court, precisely what had happened to April once she was inside his vehicle, or later inside his home. He offered only the roadside accident story, repeated with minor variations, protected by a claimed alcohol-induced memory loss that conveniently erased exactly the details investigators most needed. Prosecutor Elwyn Evans QC would later describe to the jury how, in the prosecution's view, Bridger had played a cruel and deliberate game in the aftermath of the killing, working to actively mislead investigators and the searching public alike, all while the largest manhunt in British policing history combed the countryside for a little girl he already knew would never be found. The next morning, unaware that police were already watching him, Bridger was spotted near the River Dyfi, which runs through McKinley, carrying a plastic bag. He was arrested at the roadside, about 30 minutes after officers had searched his home. The arresting officer would later describe him as an emotional wreck in the moments after he was stopped. And when he was taken into custody, Bridger said something that would hang over the entire case from that point forward. He told the officer, "I know what it's all about." The officer asked him directly, "Where is she?" Bridger's answer was immediate. "It was an accident. I crushed her with the car. I don't know where she is." That was his story from the very beginning, and it never really changed. He claimed he had accidentally hit April with his vehicle, panicked, and could not remember what he had done with her body afterward because he'd been drinking. Police did not believe him. The blood and bone fragments recovered from inside his own cottage rather than anywhere near a roadside made that account very difficult to sustain. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the evidence and authorized police to charge Bridger not just with murder, but with child abduction, and with attempting to pervert the course of justice, specifically for unlawfully disposing of, destroying, or concealing April's body. April's body has never been found, despite the biggest search in British policing history. Despite months of searching rivers, hillsides, and forests across mid-Wales, nothing was ever recovered that could bring April's parents the one thing every grieving family desperately needs: somewhere to finally lay their child to rest. The trial that followed, held at Mold Crown Court, lasted 4.5 weeks, and it exposed, piece by piece, exactly who Mark Bridger really was. Underneath the ordinary surface of a man who had worked as a slaughterhouse worker and a lifeguard, who had lived quietly in a small Welsh village for years. Prosecutor Elwyn Evans QC told the trial that Bridger had murdered 5-year-old April and had then played what she called a cruel game, deliberately attempting to cover his tracks and mislead investigators about what had actually happened to her. Jurors were told that Bridger was a fantasist with what was described as a clear interest in child pornography and in child murder cases. On the night April disappeared, before he ever encountered her, he had been watching a brutal rape scene from a horror film. Officers who searched his laptop found child sexual abuse images stored on the device, alongside photographs of children from the local area. This was not a man who had stumbled into a single moment of panic and violence. This was a man whose private life, hidden behind an ordinary front door in an ordinary village, had been building toward exactly this kind of horror for some time. The prosecution did not dwell on the specifics of that material beyond what was necessary to establish motive and premeditation to the jury. What mattered, for the purposes of securing a conviction, was demonstrating that Bridger's actions on the 1st of October were not some isolated, uncharacteristic lapse, but the culmination of fixations he had been nurturing privately for a considerable period of time before April Jones ever crossed his path. Bridger's own defense team had little room to work with against this weight of evidence. He never took the stand to offer any account beyond the roadside accident story he'd given at the moment of his arrest, an account the physical evidence inside his own cottage had already thoroughly undermined before the trial had even properly begun. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 6 minutes. Unanimous verdict: guilty. Guilty of April's abduction. Guilty of her murder. Guilty of perverting the course of justice by concealing her body. At sentencing, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams did not hold back. He told Bridger plainly that he had abducted April for a sexual purpose and then murdered her and disposed of her body to hide the evidence of your sexual abuse of her. He called Bridger a pathological and glib liar. He told him directly, "There is no doubt in my mind that you are a pedophile who has for some time harbored sexual and morbid fantasies about young girls." Bridger stood in the dock, impassive, as most of the sentence was read out. But when the judge addressed his perverted interest in violent child abuse, Bridger shook his head, the only visible reaction he gave throughout the entire proceeding. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a whole life order, meaning he will never be released. Not after 15 years. Not after 25. Not ever. He will die in prison. Whole life orders are reserved in England and Wales for only the most serious and exceptional murders, a category that includes a very small number of Britain's most notorious killers. Bridger's name now sits alongside serial killer Peter Moore, who murdered 4 men along the North Wales coast in the 1990s, and other prisoners whose crimes were judged too severe, too calculated, and too without prospect of rehabilitation to ever justify release. It is among the harshest sentences that British law allows, and it reflects just how unambiguously the courts viewed what Bridger had done to a 5-year-old girl who had simply been riding her bike outside her own home. For the town of Manhunt, the guilty verdict didn't bring the kind of closure people might expect. Reporters who visited afterward described a community still visibly in pain, still processing not just the loss of a 5-year-old girl from their streets, but the fact that a man who had lived quietly among them for years had been hiding something this monstrous the entire time. Let's talk about what that actually meant for the people who lived there. Manhunt is a small town. Everyone knows everyone, or near enough. Mark Bridger wasn't a passing stranger who drove through once and vanished. He had lived in the area, worked in the area, been a familiar enough face that his eventual arrest didn't just shock the town, it forced an entire community to reconsider every previous interaction they'd ever had with him. The former colleague who'd worked alongside him, the neighbors who'd nodded hello, the people who'd trusted him at some point in some small, ordinary way, the way you trust anyone who's simply been around long enough to stop feeling like a stranger. And yet, what actually happened in Manhunt during those 7 months of searching tells a story just as powerful as the crime itself. Almost immediately, the town's centerpiece, the Castlereagh Memorial Clock in the middle of town, became a focal point. It was covered in pink ribbons, a symbol of hope that April would be found. An idea that started when her own mother, Coral, first tied ribbons to the gates of the family home. Those ribbons spread across the entire town within days, hung by strangers and neighbors alike, all holding on to the same fragile hope. A fund was set up to support the search efforts. Trustees, led by the local vicar, the Reverend Kathleen Rogers, were appointed to manage donations that poured in from across the country. By the time it was wound up, more than £70,000 had been raised, money that would eventually go toward supporting local children, local charities, and the search and rescue volunteers who had given so much of their own time looking for April. Even celebrities got involved from a distance. A charity auction in the town raised thousands more, boosted by donated items including shoes from actress Catherine Zeta-Jones and a jacket from singer Bonnie Tyler. The scale of ordinary community involvement in the search itself is almost impossible to overstate. Wales's first minister, speaking later at an award ceremony honoring the town, described how help came from every corner of the community, from bin men who searched endlessly on their own time to the local head teacher who worked to help school children process what had happened, to hundreds of ordinary residents who searched day and night, making sandwiches, donating food, doing whatever they could to support the effort. April's funeral took place at St. Peter's Church in Machynlleth, with hundreds of people turning out to say goodbye to a 5-year-old girl most of them had never personally met, but whose loss had become, in those 7 months, something the entire town had carried together. Her parents, Coral and Paul, followed a horse-drawn hearse carrying her coffin to the church. Because her body was never recovered in full, there could be no traditional burial in the way most grieving families are able to have. But small fragments of bone, recovered by Dyfed Powys police from Bridger's cottage, were eventually formally released to April's family following a coroner's hearing, giving them at least something, however small, to lay to rest. In the years that followed, a memorial and tribute garden was created on the community green, just yards from where April had lived, close to where she used to play. Visitors still leave toys and teddy bears there today. A wooden bench, carved with a brass tag reading April's Bench, was built by staff at the nearby Center for Alternative Technology. A hugging tree, covered in pink knitted squares made by local residents, was created as a place where people could sit, reflect, and leave messages for April. In 2014, Mount Pleasant, the cottage where April had been killed, was purchased by the Welsh government and demolished at the request of the local community. April's family witnessed the demolition in person. Her father described it as a symbolic thing, expressing hope that the village of seniors could finally return to some sense of normality, no longer overshadowed by the presence of the house where their daughter had died. The following year, the community of Machynlleth received a special recognition award from the Welsh government itself, honoring the extraordinary way the town had come together, both during the search and in the years of grief that followed. The Reverend Kathleen Rogers, speaking on behalf of the community, said that April, in her very short life, had left what she called a lasting legacy of unity, compassion, and love. There were also uncomfortable questions raised about the police investigation itself, about how a convicted, deeply disturbed individual with these kinds of fixations had been living in the community without anyone realizing the danger he posed until it was already too late. Those questions didn't have easy answers. They rarely do in cases like this. The uncomfortable truth investigators and communities alike had to sit with was that Bridger's outward life gave almost no warning signs visible to the people around him. He held down work. He didn't have an obvious history of prior violence that would have flagged him as an active danger to children in the area. Whatever was building inside him, whatever collection of disturbing material and fixations the trial eventually exposed, none of it was visible enough from the outside for anyone in Machynlleth to have seen it coming. That is, in many ways, the hardest lesson this case leaves behind. It offers no simple checklist for spotting the next Mark Bridger before he acts. It simply demonstrates, in the most devastating way possible, that someone can live inside a small, close community for years, hiding something this dangerous without a single neighbor, colleague, or friend ever suspecting a thing. And it demonstrates just as powerfully what that same community is capable of when tragedy finally does arrive. Ribbons on every gate. Hundreds of volunteers walking fields in the cold, a fund that raised tens of thousands of pounds, and a memorial garden that still to this day welcomes anyone who wants to remember a 5-year-old girl who simply loved being outside with her friends. April's parents, Paul and Coral Jones, continued fighting for answers even after the conviction. Bridger initially sought leave to appeal his whole life sentence, and a hearing date was set for late January 2014, more than a year after the original trial had concluded. April's parents told reporters they planned to attend that hearing themselves, but 11 days before it was due to take place, Bridger abandoned the application entirely, dropping his bid to overturn the sentence without ever going before the appeal judges. April's grandfather, Di Smith, described the news as a weight off our minds, a small measure of relief for a family that had already been forced to relive the case once simply by the prospect of the appeal being heard. Even behind bars, Bridger's case continued to generate headlines. In July 2013, only weeks after his conviction, he was attacked and wounded by another inmate at a high-security prison. The attacker, a man already serving a life sentence for a separate murder, later pleaded guilty to the assault. It was a stark illustration of just how reviled Bridger had become, even among a prison population that includes many people convicted of serious violence themselves. Perhaps the most haunting detail to emerge from the entire case came from the sentencing judge himself, addressing the one question that has never been answered: what actually happened to April's body? Mr. Justice Griffith Williams told Bridger directly that how he disposed of her body must remain a mystery, and that he would not speculate further in open court. But he added that all the indications were that Bridger had burned at least part of her remains in the wood burner inside his own cottage, the same small stove that had, in the days after April's disappearance, made the property hot and filled with the smell of cleaning products when police first searched it. That detail, more than almost any other in the case, explains why April's body was never recovered despite the largest search in British policing history. It also explains why her parents have never been given the one thing that might have offered them even a small measure of peace, somewhere to bury their daughter. What makes this case so difficult to sit with isn't just the brutality of what happened to April Jones. It's the gap between who Mark Bridger appeared to be and who he actually was. A former lifeguard. A former slaughterhouse worker. Someone who had lived in a small Welsh village among neighbors for years without raising alarm. And underneath all of that, a laptop full of child sexual abuse material. A documented fascination with child murder cases, and a set of fantasies about young girls that the trial judge said he had harbored for some time, long before he ever encountered April Jones playing on her bike outside her own home. There is a particular kind of dread specific to cases like this one. It's the recognition that predators do not always look like predators. They coach youth sports. They work as lifeguards, watching over children at swimming pools for years. They live on ordinary streets, in ordinary cottages, in small towns where everybody thinks they already know everybody. Mark Bridger fit that description exactly, right up until the evening he pulled his car up next to a 5-year-old girl riding her bike, and took her. The largest police search in British history was launched to find April Jones alive. It ended instead with a conviction, a whole life sentence, and a community left to grieve a little girl whose body was never returned to her family, no matter how many fields were searched, how many rivers were dragged, or how many volunteers gave up months of their lives trying to bring her home. April Jones was 5 years old. She loved being outside with her friends. She had just come home from swimming lessons on the last ordinary evening of her life. Her family has never gotten the chance to bury her. What they got instead, after 4.5 weeks in a courtroom, was the truth about the man responsible, and a sentence that ensures he will never again have the freedom to hurt another child the way he hurt April. That is the smallest possible justice a family can be given after losing everything. It is also, in April's case, the only justice that was ever going to be possible. Because the one thing that might have brought her parents any further peace, the chance to finally lay their daughter to rest, was taken from them the same night she was taken from her own front garden, and it has never been given back. Her name and her story are the reason Mid-Wales changed the way it thought about safety on its own quiet streets. A search this large, a manhunt this intense, a trial this exposing, all triggered by a few seconds on an ordinary evening when a little girl on a bike trusted, or simply didn't have time to question the wrong car pulling up beside her. Remember April Jones as she was before that evening, a happy little girl who loved her bike, her swimming lessons, and her friends on the street where she'd grown up. That is who deserves to be remembered, not the man who took her from all of it. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we close this out, and it has nothing to do with Mark Bridger at all. It's the fact that a town of barely 2,000 people, faced with the worst possible thing that can happen to a community, chose not to turn inward, not to close its doors, not to give in to fear. It chose ribbons on every gate. It chose bin men walking fields on their days off. It chose a head teacher staying late to help frightened children make sense of something no child should ever have to make sense of. It chose a fund that raised tens of thousands of pounds, distributed afterward to local children, charities, and the very search and rescue volunteers who had given so much of themselves looking for a little girl they were desperate to bring home. None of that undid what happened. Nothing could. April's parents still don't have a grave to visit in the way most grieving families do. They have fragments released after a coroner's hearing and a memorial garden built from pink flowers and donated toys, close to the community green where their daughter used to play. But the way Machinlith responded, the way an entire town refused to let one man's darkness define what the place actually stood for, is its own kind of answer to a story this devastating. It doesn't erase the horror of what Mark Bridger did, it simply proves that horror doesn't get the final word. Not entirely. Not in a town that decided collectively to hold on to April, to remember her exactly as she was, and to keep showing up for each other long after the cameras had gone home and the search had ended. Let's go back to that search itself for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing mention. For 7 months, before Bridger's whole life sentence finally closed the legal chapter of this case, Machinlith lived in a strange, suspended state between hope and grief. The pink ribbons that first appeared on Coral Jones's own gate spread across the entire town within days, tied by strangers who had never met April but who wanted, in whatever small way they could, to be part of holding out hope for her safe return. Shop windows displayed them. Lampposts along the main street were wrapped in them. Visitors driving through mid-Wales during those months would have seen a town that had, almost overnight, transformed its own public spaces into a collective, visible act of solidarity for one missing child. That visible solidarity mattered enormously to the family at the center of it. It meant that Paul and Coral Jones were never simply left to grieve or hope in isolation. An entire town had in effect adopted their daughter's disappearance as something the whole community was responsible for resolving, searching, praying over, and eventually mourning together. When the guilty verdict finally came down at Mold Crown Court, that same sense of collective ownership carried straight through into how the town chose to remember April afterward. The memorial garden wasn't commissioned by a council committee working from a formal brief. It began, according to those who helped create it, when friends and family simply got together informally only weeks after the trial concluded, and started building something with their own hands. Pink flowers, a pink doll's house, furry toys donated by local children, a bench built by craftsmen at a nearby technology center. It was, in every sense, a community project born from grief rather than a formal civic memorial imposed from above. That's the story of April Jones. A 5-year-old girl taken from an ordinary street on an ordinary evening, a manhunt larger than any Britain had ever seen, a trial that exposed a predator hiding behind a completely unremarkable life, and a small Welsh town that, even now, still leaves toys and ribbons for a little girl who simply loved being outside with her friends. She was 5 years old. She loved her bike, her swimming lessons, and the friends who lived on her street. That is who April Jones was, and that is how she deserves to be remembered, long after the headlines faded and the search teams went home. Her family, and the town that stood beside them, made sure of that. Nearly a decade on, that memorial garden on the Bryn Gog estate is still tended. The bench still carries its brass tag. The pink flowers are still replanted each year. Machinlith never got the ending it hoped for back in October 2012, but it built out of that unbearable loss, a permanent physical reminder that a 5-year-old girl who once rode her bike on that same patch of ground was loved by far more people than just her own family, and still is.